Tonight, he is the most ruthless crime boss in Chicago. By the next morning, he's a penniless freeloader without a dime to his name. Having survived a raging fire set by his own family, the Mafia boss then falls and hits his head, losing every trace of his memory, all because he swerved to avoid a poor young woman's truck. From a man who ruled an entire empire, he accidentally becomes her picked-up husband. The girl thinks she's taken in a gentle, harmless young man, never knowing she's hiding a devil about to burn the whole underworld to the ground. Before you watch how the devil rises again, drop a comment with the city you're living in. That night, on the cold shore of Lake Michigan, a warehouse burned to the ground. Luca Ferraro, head of the Ferraro family, a man whose mere frown could make half of Chicago hold its breath, knelt amid the flames, his body worn down after a brutal beating, listening to his own cousin laugh cruelly. "Today is the day you die, Luca. Once you're gone, this family will be mine." The fire swallowed everything, but some wolves don't die in the fire. They only lose their way home. That same night, in the pouring rain, Delaney Brooks drove her beat-up pickup, carrying the last sack of flour back to a bakery drowning in debt. A staggering figure lurched into the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt just steps away from him, never touching him, but the exhausted man flinched, stumbled, struck his head on the curb, and collapsed. Only the rain, and a nameless stranger lying right before her eyes. A woman long used to having everything taken from her. Her father, her dreams, her love, should have turned away, but she couldn't. And when the man woke, asking with hollow eyes, "Who am I? Where am I?" she never imagined she had picked up not just a man without a memory, but a storm about to tear through her quiet life. Her mother, quietly hiding a terminal illness of her own, then had a wild idea: to marry off this gentle, strong, homeless young man as a son-in-law, so that someone would stay by her daughter's side, forever. No one in that small room knew that the name they gave him, Ash, meaning the remains of fire, would one day rise again into a blaze that consumed every enemy in its path. Only, before that fire could reignite, the man who once owned an empire would first have to learn something power had never taught him: what it means to be loved when there is nothing left in your hands. The morning after the storm, sunlight spilled thin and pale through the cracked window of the little room above Brooks's bakery, and Colleen Brooks sat at the edge of the narrow bed watching the sleeping stranger with the calculating tenderness of a woman who had long since learned to squeeze hope from stone. Delaney had barely closed her eyes all night, and when her mother finally spoke the idea aloud, she nearly dropped the kettle. Marry him. Just like that. Colleen said it the way she might suggest adding cinnamon to the bread, as if the fate of two lives were nothing more than a recipe adjustment. Lainey laughed, sharp and bitter, and told her mother she had lost her mind. The man had no name, no memory, no past she could verify, and for all they knew he could be a criminal, a runaway, a debtor worse off than they were. But Colleen only folded her worn hands in her lap and said the thing that silenced her daughter: that she did not have much time left, that she had watched Lainey give and give until there was nothing left of the girl but calluses and quiet grief, and that she was tired of dying a little every night wondering who would stay when she was gone. "He is gentle," Colleen said. "He is strong. He has nowhere to go and no reason to leave. That is more than the last one ever gave you." Lainey thought of Trevor then, of the ring he had slipped off her finger as easily as he had slipped out of her life, and something in her chest closed like a fist. 3 days later, with the stranger's fever broken and his wounds bandaged clean, they stood in the gray corridor of the city hall, while a bored clerk asked questions no one could truly answer. When the woman behind the desk asked for the groom's name, the room went silent, and it was Colleen who leaned forward and said, with a small triumphant smile, that they would call him Ash, because they had pulled him out of the worst night of his life and given him a second one. He liked the name. He said it softly, testing the shape of it, and something flickered behind his tired eyes. a shadow of a life he could not reach. They signed the papers in an hour. There was no ring, no vow rehearsed, only Colleen's hand, gripping both of theirs at the end, as she laid down her law with the gravity of a queen, dividing a kingdom. In this house, she told him, every decision, large and small, belongs to Lainey. You will listen to my daughter. If you ever make her cry, if you ever give her one more reason to stop believing in kindness, you will answer to me, sick as I am, and I promise you I have buried harder men than you look to be. Ash lowered his head and swore it, and there was a strange formality in the way he did it, a discipline that did not belong to a homeless man, a vow spoken the way soldiers and sworn men speak them. He promised he would never hurt her, that he would work, that he would earn the roof they had given him. And for one heartbeat, when he closed his eyes, a name rose unbidden from the drowned country of his memory, and slipped past his lips in a whisper so faint that only Lainey caught it. Enzo. She frowned, asking who that was, and Ash blinked, confused, the word already fading like breath on glass. He did not know. He said it felt like someone he was supposed to protect, or someone who was supposed to protect him. He could not tell which, and then the feeling was gone, and he was only a quiet man in borrowed clothes, standing beside a woman he had known for 3 days, and now called his wife. Colleen wept a little on the walk home, the happy trembling tears of the terminally hopeful, while Lainey walked ahead with her arms crossed against the cold, telling herself this was temporary, that once his memory returned she would tear up the papers and send him back to whatever world had thrown him away, never once imagining that the world he came from was already searching the ashes for the body it had failed to find. The days that followed settled into a rhythm none of them had expected, for Ash proved to be the strangest kind of miracle, a man who woke before dawn without being asked, and had the ovens warm by the time Lainey stumbled down the stairs rubbing sleep from her eyes. He learned the bakery the way some men learn a language they once knew in a dream, his hands remembering things his mind could not, folding dough with a patience that bordered on reverence, scrubbing pots until they gleamed, stacking flour sacks that had defeated Lainey for years as though they weighed nothing at all. He called her Sep, boss, with a small teasing smile that made the word sound almost tender, and every morning he would ask her what the day required of him, as if awaiting orders, and every night he would not sit to eat until she and Colleen had taken the first bite. Colleen adored him within a week, declaring to every customer who would listen that her son-in-law was worth 10 of any rich man's sons, while Lainey kept her walls up out of stubborn habit, watching him from the corner of her eye, waiting for the crack in the gentle mask that never came. But some moments unsettled her, small flickers of something that did not belong to a humble man with no past, and she could not explain them away no matter how she tried. Once, when a stranger lingered too long outside the shop window, Ash stopped mid-motion, his whole body going still and quiet in a way that reminded her of a dog that has heard a sound below human hearing, and he told her flatly, without knowing how he knew, that the man was not a customer, that he was watching the register and counting the exits. The man left, and nothing came of it, but Lainey's skin prickled for an hour afterward. Another time, when a drunk shoved his way through the door and raised his voice at her over a botched order, Ash was between them before Lainey had even registered the danger, one arm sweeping her gently behind him, his stance loose and ready and utterly certain, and the drunk took one look at his eyes and thought better of the whole thing and left muttering apologies. When it was over, Ash blinked at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else, bewildered by the ease of it, and Lainey found herself wondering, not for the first time, exactly what kind of life could leave such reflexes buried in a man who could not remember his own mother's face. Across the city, in a house of glass and cold marble far removed from the smell of warm bread, another man was losing his patience. Marco Ferraro stood at the tall windows overlooking the water where the warehouse had burned, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, and listened to his men give him the same answer they had given for days, that the fire had left nothing, that the divers had found nothing, that no body had surfaced from the black water of the lake. It should have satisfied him. A man beaten and left to burn does not walk away, and yet Marco had known his cousin too long to believe in convenient silences, had watched Luca survive things that should have killed him more times than any man had a right to, and the absence of a corpse sat in his stomach like a stone he could not swallow. "Find me proof," he told them quietly. "Proof I can hold in my hand, because until I see what is left of him, I will not stand before the old man and claim what is mine." His men assured him it was only a matter of time, that no ghost could hide forever in a city this size, and Marco nodded slowly and turned back to the window, unaware that the ghost he feared was 3 miles away, with flour on his hands and a borrowed name, learning to love a life he did not yet know he would have to fight to keep, while the thread that would one day lead the wolves to his door had already been set spinning by a wristwatch worth more than the little bakery would earn in 10 years. The bell above the door chimed on a slow Thursday afternoon, and the moment Lainey looked up from the counter and saw who had walked in, the warmth drained out of the little bakery, as if someone had opened a door onto winter. Trevor Combs stepped inside wearing a suit that cost more than the shop's monthly rent, a woman on his arm draped in furs and diamonds, who surveyed the humble room with the amused pity of a tourist visiting a slum. Lainey's hands went still on the dough. She had not seen him since the night he had returned her ring and told her, with the gentle cruelty of a man who believes himself kind, that love was a luxury a woman like her could not afford to expect. Now here he stood, smiling that same easy smile. And beside him, Bianca examined the chipped display case and wrinkled her nose as though the smell of fresh bread offended her. Trevor said he had heard through mutual friends that little Lainey Brooks was still slaving away over an oven, and wasn't that just so admirable, so honest, so quaint, and every word was a small blade wrapped in silk. He had come, he explained, to deliver an invitation in person, because after everything they had meant to each other, he simply couldn't bear the thought of her hearing the news secondhand. He and Bianca were to be engaged, a lavish affair at the Astoria downtown, all the right people, and he did so hope Lainey would come and see how happy he had become, how far he had risen, what a beautiful life he had built for himself now that he was free. Bianca laughed and murmured that surely the poor thing wouldn't have anything suitable to wear, and Trevor waved the concern away with a magnanimous smile, telling Lainey not to worry about that they wouldn't judge her for coming as she was. From the back room, Ash had gone very quiet, a dish towel forgotten in his hands, and something cold and unfamiliar was moving behind his eyes, as he watched the man speak to his wife, but Lainey did not see it, because every ounce of her attention was fixed on Trevor's smiling face, and on the old wound reopening in her chest. She remembered the years she had given him, the way she had shrunk herself smaller and smaller to fit inside his idea of a woman worth keeping, the mornings she had opened the shop alone while he slept off nights she was not invited to, and she remembered the exact shade of his indifference the day he decided she was not enough. The pain was there, sharp as ever, but beneath it something harder had taken root in the months since, something Trevor's cruelty had accidentally watered, and Lainey lifted her chin and met his eyes without a tremor. She thanked him, her voice steady and almost sweet, and told him she would be delighted to attend, that she wouldn't miss it for the world. The answer surprised him, and for just a moment the smile slipped, because he had expected her to flinch, to make excuses, to give him the small satisfaction of watching her look away. Instead, she held his gaze until it was he who glanced aside, and then she wished him and his bride every happiness with a calm that unnerved them both. When the door chimed shut behind them, and their expensive laughter faded down the street, Colleen emerged from the kitchen furious, ready to curse the man to his grave, but Lainey only stared at the door with her jaw set and her eyes dry. She had spent years being the woman they could look down upon, the poor girl who should be grateful for scraps, and she was finished bowing her head. Let them have their party, she thought. Let them dress her failure up in silk and champagne, and parade it in front of the whole city. She would walk into that room with her spine straight, and she would not give a single one of them the pleasure of seeing her break, not knowing that the quiet man watching her from the doorway had already decided that no one would humiliate his wife and walk away untouched. The trouble came 2 days later, and it came loud. 3 men filled the doorway of the little bakery just past noon, and the biggest of them, a heavy-set man with a gold tooth and rings on every finger, let the door slam behind him hard enough to rattle the display glass. He called himself Dumont, and he ran the money that Colleen had borrowed years ago when the roof caved in, and the ovens died in the same brutal winter, a debt that had swollen with interest into a number that made Lainey sick to say aloud, $150,000. Dumont strolled through the shop as though he already owned it, dragging a thick finger through the frosting of a cake in the case, telling Lainey in a bored voice that her mother's payments had stopped, that patience was a currency he had run out of, and that a debt was a debt, whether the old woman lived to pay it or not. When Lainey stood her ground and told him she needed more time, Dumont smiled the way a cat smiles at something small, and said that time was exactly what she no longer had, but that a pretty young woman had other ways of settling what she owed, and perhaps she would like to come work off the balance somewhere more private. He reached for her wrist. He never touched it. Ash was there so fast that none of them saw him cross the room, one arm sweeping Lainey behind him, his body a still and immovable wall between her and the 3 men, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than any shout. "Lainey's business is my business," he said, "and whatever she owes, you will speak of it to me, and you will keep your hands where I can see them." Dumont laughed, and his 2 men stepped forward grinning, but Ash did not move and did not blink, and something in the flat calm of his stare made the grins falter, because men who deal in fear learn to recognize it in others, and there was none of it in this man's eyes. For a long moment, the shop hung on the edge of violence, and then Ash reached slowly into his coat and drew out the one thing he had carried out of his forgotten life, the heavy wristwatch that had been on him the night Lainey found him, a sleek, dark instrument of impossible craftsmanship that looked absurdly out of place against his flour-dusted sleeve. He set it on the counter between them and told Dumont, without raising his voice, that the watch was worth $500,000, that a single one like it did not exist anywhere else in the city, and that Dumont could take it, verify it, and clear the debt in full, or he could put his hands on Lainey again and find out exactly what kind of man had walked into this bakery to stay. Dumont's greed flickered awake behind his eyes as he lifted the watch and turned it in the light, and though suspicion warred with hunger on his fat face, the hunger won, as it always did with men like him. He said he would have it appraised, that if it was real the old woman's debt was forgiven, but that if the man was lying he would come back and take the shop and everything in it. Then he pocketed the watch and left with his men, and the bell chimed cheerfully behind them as though nothing had happened. When they were gone, Lainey rounded on Ash, her voice cracking, because that watch was the only object in the world that could tell them who he truly was. The single thread that connected him to whatever family, whatever life was surely searching for him, and now it was gone into the hands of a loan shark for the sake of her mother's debt. "How could you?" she said. "That was the only way we could ever find out who you are." Ash looked at her, and there was no regret in his face at all, only a strange and certain tenderness, and he told her softly that he did not need a watch to tell him who he was, that he knew exactly who he was. He was the man who had promised to stand between her and the world, and that nothing, no name and no past and no fortune buried in his forgotten life, was worth more to him than she was, not knowing that the object now traveling across the city toward an appraiser's desk bore a maker's mark that certain men would recognize on sight, a mark that belonged to only one family in Chicago. The Astoria ballroom glittered with the kind of wealth that was meant to be seen, chandeliers dripping light onto marble floors, waiters gliding between guests with trays of champagne, and into this gilded room, Lainey walked in a simple borrowed dress with Ash quiet and watchful at her side. She had known it would be a performance staged for her humiliation, and Trevor did not disappoint. He spotted them within minutes and swept over with Bianca on his arm, announcing loudly enough for the nearest circle of guests to hear that he was so glad Lainey had come, though he did hope the dress wasn't a rental, because the last thing anyone wanted was to spill something on a garment that had to be returned. Bianca laughed her tinkling laugh and circled Lainey like an appraiser inspecting damaged goods, remarking on the cut, the color, the way it fit, each observation a small needle dressed up as concern, until a little crowd had gathered to enjoy the spectacle. Then Bianca, with a smile of pure sweetness, tipped her glass of red wine so that it splashed down the front of Lainey's dress, and gasped in theatrical apology, saying how clumsy of her, how terribly clumsy, but really it was so hard to see in a crowd, and wasn't it lucky the dress was probably cheap anyway. The guests tittered. Lainey stood very still, the cold wine soaking through the fabric to her skin, her cheeks burning, and beside her she felt Ash go rigid, but she caught his sleeve and held him, because she would not give them the fight they wanted. Trevor watched her with open pleasure, and decided to twist the knife further, observing to the room that Lainey had always been such a hard worker, that in fact her family ran a little bakery, and wouldn't it be charming if she made herself useful tonight, since clearly she was more comfortable serving than being served. He plucked a tray of empty glasses from a passing waiter and held it out to her with a grin, telling her to go on, that no one would think less of her, that it was simply where a girl like her belonged. The cruelty of it landed in the silence like a stone, and even some of the watching guests looked away, uncomfortable, but Bianca clapped her hands in delight and said yes, let her serve. Let everyone see the difference between people who were born to this world and people who only dreamed of it. Ash stepped forward then, and his voice cut through the laughter with a cold precision that made the nearest guests fall quiet, telling Trevor that he would not speak to his wife that way again. Trevor turned, taking in the plain suit, the calloused hands, the man he assumed was some laborer Lainey had settled for, and his smile turned vicious. He said that this must be the famous husband, and asked whether he had rented his suit the way his wife had rented her dress, and the crowd laughed again, hungry for more. But Trevor was a man who could not leave a wound half-made, and so he reached for the cruelest game he could imagine, gesturing grandly toward the long table at the side of the room where the evening's rarest wines had been arranged for display, bottles worth fortunes, vintages most of the guests had only read about. He announced to the gathering crowd that since this humble baker and his laborer husband had graced them with their presence, they should prove they belonged among civilized people, that Ash should taste the wines and name them, every one, and if he could not, if he failed even once as any commoner surely would, then he and his wife would spend the rest of the night as the servants Trevor knew them to be, clearing tables and pouring drinks for their betters, while the whole room watched. The guests murmured with delighted anticipation, certain they were about to witness a slaughter, and Bianca leaned close to whisper that Lainey should have stayed in her little shop where she belonged, while Trevor spread his arms wide and asked, with a smile like a blade, whether the baker's husband accepted, or whether he would like to save them all the embarrassment and simply kneel now. Ash walked to the long table without a word, and something in the way he moved changed the air in the room, an unhurried certainty that did not match the laborer they had all decided he was. Lainey's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched him lift the first glass, because she knew what defeat would cost them, and she had no reason to believe a man who could not remember his own name could know the difference between one fortune in a bottle and another. But Ash raised the glass to the light, tilted it, breathed it in, and let a single drop touch his tongue, and when he set it down he named it without hesitation, the vineyard, the region, the year, in a low, even voice that carried to every corner of the hushed ballroom. Trevor's smile tightened. Ash moved to the second glass, and the third, and with each one his voice grew surer, naming vintages that the sommelier standing nearby confirmed with a slow, astonished nod. Wines from cellars across the world that no ordinary man should have ever tasted, and the laughter that had filled the room drained away into a stunned and prickling silence. Bianca's smug expression curdled. Trevor watched, rigid, as the man he had meant to break walked down the length of the table, naming each treasure in turn, never wrong, never uncertain, his calloused hands cradling each glass with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times in another life. The guests began to murmur, and the murmur carried a new note now, not amusement, but unease, because there was something in the stranger's bearing that did not belong to the plain suit he wore. When Ash reached the final bottle, set apart from the rest on a small pedestal of its own, the sommelier himself leaned in to watch, for this was the crown of the collection, a wine so rare that only a handful of bottles existed anywhere, and Trevor had placed it there certain no living soul outside a museum could name it. Ash lifted the glass. He breathed it in, and for a moment his eyes changed, the mild confusion draining out of them, and something older and colder rising in its place, a flicker of a man accustomed to owning rooms like this one, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something quiet and almost dangerous. He named the wine, and then he named more than the wine, saying that this vintage did not come from any commercial cellar at all, that it was bottled privately, that there were fewer than a dozen in existence, and every one of them belonged to a single family in this city, the Ferraro family, whose private reserve never left their estate, and he wondered aloud, softly, how a bottle that was never sold had found its way onto this table. The silence that followed was total. The sommelier had gone pale, and from somewhere in the crowd a voice breathed the name Ferraro, and another guest whispered that the man's face, now that they truly looked, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Don who ran half the shadows of Chicago, the man the papers had quietly reported missing. Ash blinked. The cold thing behind his eyes receded as quickly as it had come, and he set the glass down and looked around at the staring faces with a return of that gentle bewilderment, as though he could not understand why the room had fallen so quiet, as though the words that had just left his mouth had come from someone else entirely. Trevor stood frozen, humiliated in his own triumph, and Lainey stepped forward with her chin high and her eyes bright, telling the room in a clear voice that perhaps her husband was more than any of them had assumed, and that perhaps it was time they cleared the tables themselves, since the wager had been theirs to lose. A ripple of nervous laughter met her, but no one dared repeat Trevor's cruelty now, and Bianca pulled at her fiancé's arm, her face flushed with a rage she could not vent. Lainey took Ash's hand and led him toward the door with the whole ballroom parting before them, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the sweet, clean burn of vindication in her chest. But near the edge of the room, a man neither of them noticed had not looked away since the word Ferraro left Ash's lips. An older gentleman with silver at his temples and stillness in his eyes. A man who had once sat across a table from Luca Ferraro years ago and never forgotten the face, and who now watched the baker's husband walk out into the night with a frown carving slowly across his brow. The high of that night did not last, for grief has a way of waiting in the wings until the applause fades, and it came for them 3 mornings later in the small, warm kitchen behind the shop. Lainey had gone upstairs to change the delivery ledgers when she heard the sound, a soft, heavy thud, and the clatter of a mixing bowl striking the floor, and she was down the stairs before she had finished drawing breath. Colleen lay crumpled beside the work table, her face gray, her lips bloodless, one hand still curled as though reaching for the counter she had tried to catch. Ash was already kneeling at her side, lifting her with a careful strength, and between them they got her into the truck and drove through the gray morning to the county hospital, while Lainey gripped her mother's cold hand and told her over and over that everything would be fine, that she just needed rest, that she had been working too hard. But when the doctor drew Lainey aside into the quiet of the corridor, his face carried the particular gentleness that doctors reserve for the news no one wants to hear, and he asked her, carefully, how long her mother had been unwell. Lainey did not understand the question, and then he showed her the bottles, the medications he had found in Colleen's purse, prescriptions filled at a pharmacy across town, under a name Lainey had not recognized, and he explained in a low voice that these were not the pills of a woman merely tired. that they were something else entirely, that her mother had been managing a serious illness for months without a word to anyone. The word he used landed in Lainey's chest like cold water closing over her head. Cancer. He told her, kindly and without flinching, that it had already advanced, that with treatment, there was hope, but that every week of delay narrowed the road ahead, that this was not something that could be outrun with rest and stubbornness, and that her mother would need real care, and soon. Lainey stood in the hallway with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and felt the floor tilt beneath her, because she had spent her whole life bracing for the next thing the world would take from her, and she had never once let herself imagine it would be her mother, the one fixed point, the one warmth that had never gone cold. When she went back into the room, Colleen was already sitting up against the pillows, waving away the nurse, insisting she was perfectly well, that it had only been the heat of the ovens and an empty stomach, and when she saw her daughter's stricken face, she reached out and gripped her hand with a strength that seemed impossible for a woman so pale. "Don't you dare look at me like that," Colleen said, her voice fierce and trembling all at once. "I am not made of glass. I have carried sacks of flour up those stairs that would flatten a man half my age, and I will be doing it long after you have gray hair of your own." Later, when Lainey stepped out to speak with the pharmacist about the prescriptions, Colleen caught the doctor by the sleeve and pulled him close, and there was nothing frail in her eyes now, only the iron of a mother who has decided something. She begged him not to tell her daughter the full truth. Not the timelines, not the odds, not the hard edges of it. "That girl has given up everything already," Colleen whispered. "Her whole youth, her dreams, her chances, poured out for me, and this shop, and I will not have her spend whatever days I have left, watching me like a deathbed. Let her believe it is manageable, let her keep smiling a little longer. I will take the treatments quietly, and I will fight this my own way, and if the day comes that I cannot hide it any longer, then we will face it, but not yet." The doctor hesitated, torn between his duty and the ferocity of the woman's love, and at last he gave a small, reluctant nod, and Colleen sank back against the pillows with a satisfied breath, already rebuilding her armor of jokes and complaints before Lainey returned, never guessing that the illness she meant to fight so quietly would move faster and crueler than any of them were prepared for. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of quiet afternoon that gives no warning, when the silver-haired man from the engagement party walked into the little bakery as though drawn there by a thread he could not name. Lainey recognized him at once, the stillness of him, the careful eyes, and her stomach dropped even before he spoke, because she had seen the way he had watched Ash leave that ballroom, and she had not forgotten it. He introduced himself pleasantly as a man who appreciated good bread and browsed the cases with unhurried interest, but his gaze kept drifting toward the back where Ash stood at the ovens, and after a moment he asked, in a light conversational tone that did not fool Lainey for a second, whether her husband might come out so he could compliment the baker directly. Lainey's mind raced. She called back over her shoulder that her husband was busy with a batch, but the man only smiled and lingered, saying he had all the time in the world, and there was a patience in him that frightened her more than any threat. The patience of a man who was quietly certain of something and only needed to see the proof. When Ash finally stepped out, wiping his hands, the stranger went very still, his eyes narrowing as they moved over the familiar planes of that face, and Lainey watched recognition begin to gather in them like a storm building on the horizon. She spoke before she could think better of it, stepping quickly between them, and the lie came out of her in a bright, nervous rush, that she was so sorry but her poor husband had suffered a terrible allergic reaction, that he had eaten shellfish and broken out in a dreadful rash across his whole face, that it was frightful to look at and terribly embarrassing for him, and she reached up and pulled his collar higher and fussed with a clean dish towel, winding it around his jaw and cheek, as though shielding an inflammation, chattering all the while to fill the silence. Ash, bless him, followed her lead with the trusting obedience that had become his nature, ducking his head and turning away, mumbling an apology for his appearance, and behind the wrapped cloth only his eyes and brow remained visible. The silver-haired man watched all of this, and Lainey could see him weighing it, could see the doubt flicker against the certainty, because the face he thought he knew was half hidden now, and the story was plausible enough, and a man of his position did not act on a resemblance alone. He had learned long ago what it cost to be wrong about such things, to raise an alarm and be mistaken, and the man before him wore flour on his sleeves and stammered apologies, and let his little wife wind a towel around his head, and none of that belonged to the Don he remembered, the man whose glance could silence a room. And yet, he studied Ash a moment longer, and something unsatisfied moved behind his eyes, but at last he inclined his head, purchased a loaf he did not want, and told Lainey her husband should see a doctor about that allergy, that some reactions were more serious than they appeared. Then he stepped out into the gray afternoon, and Lainey sagged against the counter with her heart pounding, watching through the window as he paused on the sidewalk and glanced back at the shop one last time before walking on. He did not make a call. He did not send word to anyone. Not yet. For he was a careful man, and he would not stake his name on a hunch. But the doubt had lodged in him now like a splinter under the skin, and as he walked away down the wet street, he found himself thinking that he would come back, that he would find a way to see that face without a towel wrapped around it. And Lainey, watching him go, understood with a cold clarity that whatever storm she had taken in off the road, that rainy night was beginning, at last, to circle back toward its own. The weeks after Dumont's men had stormed through the shop had left their mark, for word travels fast in a neighborhood, and customers who had once lingered over coffee now hurried past the window as though trouble were catching, and the little bell above the door fell silent for long stretches that Lainey counted in dread. With Colleen's medical bills mounting, and the ovens sometimes cooling for want of orders, Lainey sat at the counter one gray morning, with the ledger open before her, and her head in her hands, and it was Ash who found her there, and Ash, of all people, who had the ridiculous idea that would save them. He had noticed, in his guileless way, that the young women who did come in tended to linger at the counter, and blush, and find excuses to ask him questions, and he suggested, with the earnest innocence of a man who did not fully grasp his own effect, that perhaps the bakery could offer something more than bread. Within a week, the shop had a hand-painted sign in the window advertising that for the price of a coffee and a pastry, a customer might have a photograph taken with the handsome baker, and Lainey, who had agreed only because she was desperate and half certain it would embarrass them both, watched in astonishment as a line formed down the block. Ash bore it all with bewildered good humor, posing stiffly beside giggling college students and blushing grandmothers, holding trays of croissants aloft, letting Colleen, revived by the spectacle, work the register and shout encouragement, and quietly overcharge anyone who flirted too boldly. The bell rang without stopping. The ovens ran hot from dawn to dusk. And somewhere in the middle of that absurd golden week, Lainey caught herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember, watching this man who could name the private wines of a crime dynasty stand red-faced, while a customer straightened his apron for a photo, and the sight cracked something open in her chest that she had kept sealed for years. That night, after the last customer had gone, and the shop was quiet and warm and smelled of sugar, she found him wiping down the counters, and she stood in the doorway watching him, and she said quietly that she did not know what she would have done without him, and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with money. Ash looked up, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the space between them filled with something new and fragile, and he told her, simply, that he did not remember his old life at all, but that he could not imagine it had ever felt like this, that whoever he had been before, he did not want him back if it meant leaving here. Lainey's throat tightened, and she did not have the words to answer, so she only crossed the room and stood beside him, and let her shoulder rest against his arm, and they finished cleaning the shop in a silence that said more than either of them dared to. But happiness, for people like Lainey, has always carried a shadow behind it, and the very thing that had saved the bakery had planted a seed of ruin, because the photographs of the handsome baker had not stayed on the block. A customer had posted one online with a laughing caption, and it had traveled the way such things do, passed from phone to phone across the city, and it had come to rest, at last, on a screen in a cold marble office where a man named Marco Ferraro sat studying an appraiser's report about a certain wristwatch that had surfaced in a pawnbroker's ledger. He looked from the report to the photograph of the smiling baker with flour on his hands, and the stone that had sat in his stomach for weeks turned slowly to ice, because he knew that face, he had grown up beside that face, and no fire and no water and no borrowed apron could disguise it from the one man who had every reason to be certain his cousin was dead. In the cold marble office above the city, Marco Ferraro laid the two pieces side by side on the glass desk and let himself, at last, believe the thing he had feared for weeks. On the left was the appraiser's report, tracing a wristwatch of unmistakable make through a loan shark named Dumont, back to a debt owed by a bakery on the working side of town, a watch that bore the private mark of the Ferraro house, a watch that had last been seen on his cousin's wrist the night of the fire. On the right was a photograph passed 1,000 times across 1,000 screens, a smiling man with flour on his hands, standing behind a humble counter, and though the apron was absurd, and the smile was one Marco had never seen on that face in all their years, the bones beneath it belonged to Luca, and to no one else. He had survived. Of course he had survived, Marco thought, with a bitterness that curdled into something close to admiration, because the man had always been impossible to finish, but the photograph told him something else, something that turned his dread into a slow and dangerous opportunity. The Luca in that picture did not carry himself like a Don. There was no menace in him, no calculation, only an open and guileless warmth that the real Luca had never once shown the world, and Marco understood then, with the sharp instinct that had carried him this far, that his cousin did not know who he was. The fire had taken his memory along with everything else. Marco sat back in his chair and turned the possibility over slowly, because a Luca who remembered was a blade at his throat, but a Luca who had forgotten was merely a man who could disappear a second time, and this time for good, with no one the wiser and no ghost to rise from the ashes. He was still weighing it when the door opened, and Vivian Castellano let herself in without knocking, as she always did, draped in the certainty of a woman who had been promised a throne. She had heard the whispers already, the servants' talk, the murmur that Luca might be alive, and she crossed to the desk and looked down at the photograph, and her beautiful face went cold and still. She had spent years waiting to become Mrs. Ferraro, had endured Luca's indifference and his absences and his refusal to name a wedding date, and she had almost begun to believe the fire had freed her to grieve prettily and marry someone else who would still make her a queen. But here he was, alive, and worse than alive, he was smiling in a way he had never smiled at her, standing beside some flour-dusted nobody in a failing shop, and the sight of it lit a jealousy in her so pure and so venomous that it frightened even Marco. She asked him who the woman was, and when he told her it was only the baker's daughter, some poor girl of no consequence, Vivian's laugh was thin and sharp as breaking glass. She said that if Luca had forgotten himself, then the kindest thing, the most sensible thing, would be to make certain he never remembered, and she looked at Marco with a meaning that needed no words, because they had never been allies before, but they wanted, for once, the very same thing. Marco wanted the empire that a forgotten cousin could no longer claim. Vivian wanted the man, or, if she could not have the man N, then the ruin of the woman who had. Together they leaned over the photograph like two predators over a scent, and Marco spoke at last, quietly, saying that they would bring him in, quietly and carefully, before the old man or anyone loyal to the true Luca could catch wind of it, and that once they had him somewhere private, somewhere far from that little shop and that meddling girl, they would make certain that whatever remained of the Don they feared was buried so deep it would never surface again. They came for them in the dead hour before dawn, when the shop was dark and the streets were empty, and it was over, almost before Lainey understood it was happening. Hands in the black quiet, a cloth over her mouth, Ash shouting her name once before something silenced him, and then the long swaying dark of a vehicle, and the smell of cold water, and old smoke growing stronger with every mile. When the hood was pulled from her head, she was on her knees on a concrete floor in a vast burned-out shell of a building, blackened beams overhead, the walls streaked with the ghost of an old fire, and beside her Ash knelt with his hands bound, blinking at the ruin around them as though some part of him recognized this place. Marco Ferraro stepped out of the shadows in a coat that cost more than the bakery, and he looked at the two of them kneeling in the ash with the satisfaction of a man who has finally cornered a thing that has eluded him too long. He crouched before Ash and studied his face with open curiosity, and then he began to talk, because men like Marco cannot resist an audience when they believe they have already won, and every word he spoke fell on Lainey like a stone. He told them this was where it had happened, this very warehouse, this very floor, where he had watched his cousin burn, or thought he had. He said the name aloud, savoring it. Luca. He told the blank-faced man kneeling before him that he was Luca Ferraro, head of the family, the Don who had stood between Marco and everything he had ever wanted, and that it had been Marco who arranged the fire, Marco who had ordered the men and locked the doors and stood outside listening to the flames, all so that the empire would fall to him when the old man finally named an heir. He laughed and said it was almost a pity Luca could not remember, because half the pleasure of this had always been in the taking, but that a man who could not remember his own name made for a very easy ghost to bury for good. And as Marco spoke, something began to happen behind Ash's eyes. The name struck the walls of his ruined memory like a fist, and the smell of the old smoke, the shape of the beams overhead, the sound of that cruel familiar laugh, all of it poured into the locked room of his mind at once. And the door began to give way. His breathing changed. The gentle bewilderment that had softened his face for months drained out of it, and in its place rose something that made Marco's smile falter. A coldness, a terrible remembering, the eyes of a man surfacing from deep water into the full and dreadful light of who he had been. He remembered the fire. He remembered the betrayal. The doors, the laughter. He remembered his own name, and in the same instant that the past crashed back into him, the trained instincts of that buried life woke with it, and Luca Ferraro, still kneeling, still bound, moved his fingers with a slow, deliberate care toward the small hidden phone that his captors, seeing only a harmless baker, had never thought to search for thoroughly, and beneath the cover of his own bowed shoulders, he pressed a single sequence he had known by heart for 15 years, a silent signal to the one man alive he trusted with his life, Enzo, his right hand, the only soul in the family who had never once wavered. He did not look down. He did not change his face. He let Marco go on gloating, let him believe the man before him was still the empty vessel he had come to bury, and only Lainey, watching in terror from her knees beside him, saw the change and did not understand it, saw the stranger she had married straighten his spine by degrees and lift his head, and heard him speak at last in a voice she had never heard him use, low and even, and stripped of all its old sweetness, telling Marco that he had made one mistake tonight, the same mistake he had made 2 years ago, and that this time there would be no fire large enough to hide behind, while somewhere across the sleeping city, a phone lit up in the dark on Enzo's bedside table, and a loyal man sat bolt upright, because the dead had just called him home. For a moment, Marco only laughed at the change in him, taking it for bravado, for the empty defiance of a broken man, and he gestured lazily to the 2 guards flanking him to haul the prisoners up and be done with it. That was his second mistake. The instant the nearest man leaned down to seize him, Luca moved, and the bindings that had held a confused baker did not hold the man who had worn them, because he had spent the long minutes of Marco's gloating working them loose with the patience of someone who had done this before, and what happened next unfolded so fast that Lainey could barely follow it. Luca rose off the floor like something uncoiling, took the first guard's momentum and turned it against him, so that the man went down hard and did not get up quickly, and before the second could react, Luca was already inside his reach, precise and economical and utterly without hesitation, every motion the opposite of wasted, a man who had been trained in rooms Lainey could not imagine and had never truly forgotten a moment of it. There was no wildness in him, no fury, only a cold and dreadful competence that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been, and in the space of a few breaths, the two men who had dragged them from their beds were on the concrete, and Luca stood over them breathing evenly, turning at last toward his cousin. Marco's smile was gone now. He backed away, reaching for the pistol at his belt, but Luca had already closed the distance, and he took the weapon from Marco's hand with a twist that sent it skidding into the shadows, and for one long, terrible moment, the two cousins stood face to face in the ruin where one had tried to end the other, and Marco looked into eyes he recognized at last, the eyes of the Don he had thought he had killed, and understood that his convenient ghost had come fully back to life. But Luca did not finish it there. Somewhere in the burned dark, more of Marco's men were stirring, drawn by the noise, and Luca's first thought, his only thought, was not vengeance, but the woman still on her knees behind him. He turned from his cousin, letting Marco scramble back into the shadows, and crossed to Lainey in 2 strides and knelt and freed her hands, and when she looked up at him, her face was a wreckage of fear and confusion, because the man kneeling before her wore Ash's features but nothing of Ash's softness, and she did not know him. He saw it, the terror in her eyes, and for just a heartbeat the coldness cracked, and something of the gentle man surfaced through it, and he cupped her face in his hands and told her quietly that it was still him, that whatever she was about to learn about who he had been, right now he needed her to trust him, and to run when he told her to run. Then he pulled her to her feet and put his body between her and the dark, and he moved them both toward the broken doorway, with a controlled urgency, shielding her at every turn, absorbing the danger so that none of it reached her, and when a figure lunged from the shadows, Luca met it, and put it down without ever letting go of her hand. They came out into the gray light of the waterfront, as sirens rose somewhere in the distance, and Enzo's car was already tearing around the corner, headlights swinging across the ruin, because a loyal man had not wasted a single second after the dead had called. Behind it came a fleet of black SUVs, their tires screeching as they smashed through the rusted gates, trapping Marco's remaining men in a cage of blinding light and armed guards. Marco, realizing his fleeting empire was already crumbling, vanished into the smoke like the coward he was, abandoning the prey he thought he had won. Luca got Lainey into the back seat and climbed in after her and pulled her against his chest as the car sped away from the burning place, and only then did she begin to shake, the whole impossible night crashing down on her at once, and she pulled back and looked at him and asked in a small broken voice who he really was, because the man holding her was a stranger wearing her husband's face. Luca looked down at her, and all the ice in him had melted now into something weary and sorrowful and tender, and he told her the truth she had been circling for months, that his name was Luca Ferraro, that once he had been the most powerful and most feared man in the city, and that he was so deeply sorry, because the quiet baker she had loved and the man she now feared had always, all along, been one and the same. The Ferraro estate had not seen so many of its people gathered under one roof in years, for word had spread that the old Don meant to name his heir at last, and the great hall filled with the family's captains and cousins and allies, all of them waiting beneath the tall, dark portraits to learn whose hand the empire would fall into, now that Luca was gone. At the head of the room sat Don Aldo Ferraro, ancient and iron-eyed, and beside him stood Marco in his finest coat, pale from the night's failure but composed, certain that the girl was still loose, and the ghost still hidden, certain that by the time anyone learned the truth, the throne would already be his to defend. The old man raised his hand for silence and began to speak of legacy and blood and the weight of the name, and he had nearly reached the moment of naming Marco when the great doors at the far end of the hall swung open, and every head turned, and the murmuring died all at once into a silence so complete that Marco's own breath sounded loud in his ears. Luca walked the length of the hall in a dark suit, and he was not the flour-dusted baker now, and he was not the bound and broken prisoner. He was the dawn returned, and the crowd parted before him, and 100 whispers rose like startled birds, because the man they had mourned was walking toward them alive and unbroken, with Enzo a half-step behind, and something terrible and certain in his eyes. Marco's composure shattered. He stammered that it was impossible, that Luca had died in the fire, and the old man rose slowly from his chair with his gaze fixed on the grandson he had thought lost, and asked in a voice like cracking stone where he had been. Luca did not waste words on the story of his lost months. He crossed to the head of the room and told his grandfather and the assembled family that he had come to answer a question no one had thought to ask, which was how the fire had started, and who had profited, and he lifted his hand, and Enzo stepped forward with a slim leather folder. It was here that the loyal man's quiet work paid its debt, for in the long weeks when the family had believed Luca dead, Enzo had never once accepted it, and he had kept watching, and gathering, and holding what he found close against the day he prayed would come, and now he laid it all upon the table before the dawn. There were the account records, the family funds that had been quietly bled away in the months before the fire, transfers routed through shell after shell, until they pooled at last in holdings that belonged to Marco alone. There were the payments to the men who had set the blaze, the schedules, the movements, a paper trail that Marco in his arrogance had believed no dead man could ever assemble. Luca laid each piece down without raising his voice, letting the evidence speak where accusation would only have invited denial, and with every document the color drained further from Marco's face, and the murmur of the crowd hardened from disbelief into something colder. The old Don took up the papers one by one in his trembling, gnarled hands and read them, and when he lowered them at last his face had aged 10 years in as many minutes, because the proof of it was beyond argument, laid out in his own family's ledgers, that the grandson standing at his side had tried to murder the grandson standing before him for the sake of a throne he could not wait to inherit. Marco began to protest, to call it forgery, to plead, but the hall had turned against him now, the captain stepping back from him as though from something diseased, and Don Aldo silenced him with a single raised hand and rose to his full height and spoke the words that ended him, that from this hour, Marco was no longer of the family, that the name he had tried to steal was stripped from him, that he was cast out and would never again set foot upon Ferraro ground while the old man drew breath. Marco was led from the hall a ruined man, and Luca watched him go without triumph, only a weary grief, and when the doors closed behind his cousin, the old Don turned to the grandson he had mourned, and, for the first time in the memory of anyone present, embraced him. The joy of the reunion did not survive the week, for an empire does not pause long to celebrate a homecoming, and the old Don, having wept over the return of his grandson, turned almost at once to the matter of securing what the fire had nearly cost them. He summoned Luca to his study, and there, beneath the portraits of dead men who had built the family through blood and marriage in equal measure, Aldo told him that his disappearance had shaken the family's standing, that rivals had circled while the Don was thought dead, and that the surest way to steady the ground beneath them was the alliance they had spoken of before, the union of Ferraro and Castellano, the marriage to Vivienne that had been promised in all but ceremony for years. The old man spoke of it as a settled thing, a duty as plain as breathing, and he was already discussing dates and the strengthening of the two houses when Luca cut through it with 4 quiet words that stopped him cold. "She is my wife." Aldo stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue, and Luca told him plainly of Lainey, of the woman who had pulled him from the road and given him a name and a home when he had nothing, not even himself, and told him that they had been married these many months and that no arrangement made in his absence could undo it. The old man's face darkened, and word of it spread through the family before the day was out, and the reaction was everything Lainey would have feared had she been there to see it. "A baker's daughter," they murmured in the halls and over their dinners. "A girl from a failing shop on the wrong side of the city, a nobody with flour under her fingernails, and a mountain of debt to her name. And this was the woman the Don meant to seat beside him at the head of the most powerful family in Chicago." They spoke of it as an embarrassment, a lapse to be corrected. Some spell the girl must have worked on him while his memory was gone, and even the captains who owed Luca their loyalty exchanged uneasy glances. Because a marriage was not merely a man's affair in this world, it was the family's face turned toward its rivals, and they did not want that face to be a poor girl who smelled of bread. Vivian moved through their whispers like a woman vindicated, wearing her wounded dignity beautifully, letting them see how gracefully she bore the insult of being passed over for someone so far beneath them all. And with every sympathetic murmur she gathered to herself, she quietly sharpened the resolve that Lainey's ruin was only a matter of time. Aldo pressed his grandson hard in the days that followed, reminding him that sentiment was a luxury the head of a family could not afford, that Luca of all people knew what became of a house that let its guard down, and that whatever gratitude he owed the girl could be repaid with money and comfort and a quiet parting, that he could set her up handsomely and send her back to her old life, and no one would be the poorer for it. But Luca only listened with that flat, unreadable calm that had returned to him along with his name, and when his grandfather had finished, he said that he had spent months as a man with nothing, and that in all those months, the only person who had ever looked at him and seen something worth keeping, when he had no fortune and no power and no name to offer, had been Lainey, and that he would not now, having remembered everything, forget the one thing worth remembering. The old man fell silent at that, unconvinced but unable to answer it, and Luca left the study knowing that he had won nothing, only bought time, that the family's contempt would not vanish because he willed it to, and that somewhere in the beautiful cold rooms of the estate, a woman who had waited years to be his was already deciding that if she could not have him honestly, she would take him another way, and that the first thing she would break to do it was the girl he had chosen over her. Luca could not undo the family's contempt with a word, but he could put a wall around the woman it was aimed at, and so he arranged, quietly, for Lainey to take a position within one of the family's legitimate enterprises, the hotel and hospitality arm that ran clean and public and far from the shadows, telling himself that if she was under his roof and his eye during the day, he could keep the worst of the estate's malice from ever reaching her. Lainey, for her part, did not know at first that the position had been arranged, and she threw herself into the work with the fierce diligence of a woman who had spent her whole life earning what others were handed, determined to prove that she belonged there on her own merit, and not as the Don's charity. And in truth she was good at it, sharp and tireless, quick with people and with numbers, but her competence only sharpened the resentment of those who wanted her gone. Vivian watched and waited and chose her moment with care, and it came at the launch of a major hospitality account, a room full of the family's most important partners, the kind of evening where a single failure would follow a person for years. In the hours before the presentation, Vivian slipped into the office where Lainey had left the finished materials and, with her own manicured hands, swapped the correct documents for a set riddled with false figures and ruinous errors, and then she settled in among the guests to watch the girl destroy herself in front of everyone who mattered. But Vivian had made the mistake that arrogant people always make, which was to assume that a girl from a bakery was too small to fight back, and when the presentation opened, and the falsified figures appeared, and a ripple of confusion and contempt moved through the room, Lainey did not crumble. She went very still, and she looked at the documents that were not the documents she had prepared, and instead of stammering apologies she asked, in a clear, steady voice, that the room grant her one moment, and she requested that the building security footage from the office corridor be reviewed, because these were not the materials she had left, and someone had entered that office after she had gone. The request landed like a struck match. Vivian's smile stiffened. The footage was brought, and there for the whole room to see was the elegant figure of Vivienne Castellano, letting herself into the office in the empty hour before the launch, and leaving again with a folder that had not been hers to touch, and two members of the staff, emboldened by the proof, spoke up to confirm they had seen her there when she had no reason to be. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound Lainey had heard in weeks, and it was into that silence that Luca stepped, for he had come to the launch precisely because he did not trust the estate to leave his wife unmolested, and he crossed the room to stand beside her, and turned to the assembled partners and the watching family and said, without heat and without apology, that this woman was his wife, that any insult offered to her was an insult offered to him, and to the name they all served, and that the next person who moved against her would answer to the dawn directly. No one spoke. Vivienne stood exposed in the center of the room with her beauty curdled into something ugly, and she gathered the shreds of her dignity and left before the humiliation could deepen. But the look she threw over her shoulder at Lainey was not defeated. It was murderous. The look of a woman who has learned that her enemy is more dangerous than she assumed, and has decided to stop playing games. Lainey should have felt only triumph, and for a moment she did, standing there with Luca's hand at the small of her back, and the room's contempt turned at last upon the right person. But the victory soured within the hour, because when she returned home that night to check on her mother, she found Colleen paler than she had ever seen her, too weak to rise from her chair, waving off Lainey's alarm with a joke that did not reach her eyes, and Lainey knelt beside her, and felt the cold certainty settle over her that whatever quiet fight her mother had been waging in the shadows was beginning, at last, to be lost. Vivienne had stopped playing games, exactly as her parting look had promised, and she struck on two fronts at once, with the cold precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her pride. First came the photographs, released quietly to the society pages and the gossip channels that fed on the family's name, images carefully staged and cleverly altered, Vivienne close against Luca at some gala, his hand seemingly at her waist, the two of them captured in what looked to all the world like the intimacy of a couple long promised to each other, and the story spread that the Don had returned to his rightful match at last, and that the little baker had only ever been a stray he had taken in and would soon put out. Lainey saw the images on a screen in the hotel lobby, and felt something in her go quiet and still, and it was not, in the end, that she believed them, for she knew Luca better than the pictures wanted her to, knew the shape of his loyalty in a way no staged photograph could shake. But the images did something crueler than deceive her. They showed her, in glossy print for the whole city to admire, the world Luca truly belonged to, the beautiful people, and the beautiful rooms, and the woman who fit into them as though born there, and beside that, Lainey saw herself with perfect clarity, the flower, and the debt, and the failing shop, and the mother dying in a rented room, and the old belief she had carried her whole life rose and closed over her head, that people like her did not get to keep beautiful things, that everything she loved was only ever lent to her, and always, always came due. And then, while that wound was still open, Vivian's second blow landed, and it was aimed with terrible accuracy at the one thing Lainey could not defend. A lawyer arrived, smooth and sorrowful, with papers that spoke of lawsuits, of the debt Dumont's watch had not fully erased, of charges that could be brought against a woman who had married a man without his knowledge of who he was, of a legal war that a girl with nothing could never hope to win, and he laid it all out with the quiet menace of a man who knows his victim cannot fight. But he also laid down another paper, and an offer to go with it, that if she signed, if she quietly ended the marriage and disappeared, the lawsuits would vanish, and a sum would be provided. Enough, he said with delicate emphasis, to cover the very best care for a mother whose time was running short. It was that same night that the hospital called, that Colleen's quiet war reached its final front, that the doctors said the operation could wait no longer, and would have to be done at once, and that even then the odds were poor. that perhaps 3 in 10 came through a surgery like this one, and Lainey stood in the hospital corridor with the lawyer's papers in one hand and her phone in the other, and understood that she had come, at last, to the bottom of everything. She did not sign because she believed the photographs. She signed because her mother was on a table with a 3 in 10 chance of seeing the morning, and because the only power she had ever truly held was the power to give herself up for the people she loved, and because some worn and weary part of her had decided that a woman like her had no business clinging to a Don and his empire when her mother needed saving and the whole shining world had made it so clear she did not belong. She signed the papers with a steady hand and a heart breaking so quietly that no one heard it, and she gave them back to the lawyer and asked only that the money go to the surgery, and then she went and sat outside the operating room and folded her hands and waited, alone. While somewhere across the city, Luca did not yet know that his wife had vanished from his life with a signature. And as the long hours crawled by, and the light behind the surgical doors burned on, Lainey bowed her head over her clasped hands, and did the only thing left to a woman who had run out of everything else. She prayed, to a God she was not sure was listening, that this time, just this once, the world would not take the last thing she had left. With Lainey gone, and the marriage dissolved by her own hand, Vivian believed the board had finally been cleared for the move she had been preparing all along, and she made it without hesitation. She went to Don Aldo and to the assembled family with a claim designed to leave Luca no honorable way out, announcing that she was carrying the Ferraro heir, that she and Luca had been together in the manner of a couple long promised to one another, and that the family's own code of honor now demanded the marriage that duty and alliance had failed to secure. It was a lie, of course, a fabrication built to force a wedding and, through it, a claim on the succession itself, and Vivian wagered everything on the family's terror of scandal and its reverence for bloodline and continuity, knowing that an old man desperate to secure his legacy might swallow a great deal to protect the family's future. But she had not built the scheme alone. In the shadows behind her stood Marco, cast out and disgraced but far from finished, for a ruined man with nothing to lose is a dangerous ally, and the two of them had found in their shared hatred a common purpose, Vivian to seize through marriage the place beside the Don she had been denied, and Marco to seize through Vivian's child a future claim on the empire that had thrown him out. They were a partnership of pure calculation, each fully intending to betray the other once the prize was won, but for now their interests ran together, and their plan had one final piece, because they both understood that the only thing standing between Vivian and the throne was Luca himself, and Luca could not be reasoned with, or shamed into the marriage, while his heart still belonged elsewhere. And so they turned to the one lever that had always moved him. Vivian's people found Lainey where grief had left her, worn thin from the long vigil at her mother's bedside, and they took her quietly, and this time there was no burned warehouse, and no gloating speech, only a locked room in a house that belonged to no one anyone could trace, and a message sent to Luca that struck with surgical cruelty. The woman he had chosen over the family, the woman who had signed his marriage away to save her dying mother and asked for nothing in return, was in Vivian's hands now, and the price of her safety was written plainly, that Luca would stand at the altar and give Vivian the marriage, and the name, and the legitimacy her lie required, and that he would do it publicly and willingly, or he would never see Lainey again. When the message reached him, Luca had already been half mad with searching, for he had returned to find his wife vanished and the divorce papers filed, and the whole story of the photographs and the lawyer's threats laid bare by a tearful hotel clerk who could no longer bear to keep silent, and he had understood at once that Lainey had not left him because she doubted him, but because she had been cornered into believing it was the only way to save her mother and spare him the ruin the family promised. He had been tearing the city apart to find her when Vivian's ultimatum arrived, and reading it, he felt the old cold thing rise in him again, the Don who did not forgive, but beneath it now ran something the old Luca had never carried, a fear that had nothing to do with power or empire, and everything to do with the woman in that locked room. Vivienne and Marco believed they had finally found the one move he could not counter, the choice between the woman he loved and the family he ruled, and they settled in to wait for the beaten man to come and place his neck in the noose they had prepared, never once considering that a man who had learned, as Ash, exactly what it meant to have nothing and be loved anyway, was far more dangerous than the Dawn who had only ever known how to be feared. The wedding was arranged with breathtaking speed, for Vivienne wanted the vows spoken before Luca could find some way to slip the trap, and the family gathered once more beneath the tall, dark portraits, this time to witness a union that half of them sensed was rotten, but none dared question aloud. Luca came, as they had demanded, and he stood at the altar in his dark suit with a stillness that Vivienne mistook for surrender, and she descended the aisle radiant in her triumph, certain that the throne, and the man, and the future were all finally hers. But Luca had not spent those silent days grieving. He had spent them working, and Enzo had spent them the way he had spent the months of his master's disappearance, gathering, and what they had gathered now waited on a single screen above the gathered family. When the officiant asked whether any soul present objected to the union, Luca lifted his hand, and the great screen came to life, and the hall fell into a horrified silence as Vivienne's own voice filled the room. There, recorded in a moment she had believed private, was the whole architecture of the lie laid bare. Vivienne and the cast-out Marco bent together in the dark, plotting the false claim of an heir that did not exist, scheming to force the marriage and seize the succession, each promising to discard the other once the prize was won, every ugly calculation spoken in their own words. The color drained from Vivienne's face, as she heard herself confess her own fraud to a hall full of the family she had meant to rule, and her beauty collapsed into something small and cornered, and she turned to run, only to find the doors held by Enzo's men. Marco had been watching from the shadows at the rear of the hall, and seeing the whole design fall to ruin in an instant, he understood that this was the end of every road he had left, and a desperate man with nothing to lose reached for the only thing that had ever given him power over Luca. He seized Lainey, who had been brought there as Vivienne's insurance, and he pulled her before him as a shield and produced a weapon and backed toward the doors, his composure gone, his voice ragged, telling the room that no one would move, that he would leave this place free, or he would not leave it caring what happened, and for one frozen moment, the whole family stood paralyzed, and Lainey's terrified eyes found Luca's across the length of the hall. What happened next happened faster than the eye could follow, but it was not the wild violence of a cornered animal. It was the cold, precise certainty of a man who had made his choice in the half-second it took to meet his wife's gaze. Luca moved, and his only care in the world was to put himself between the danger and the woman he loved. And he crossed the distance and turned Marco's own desperation against him, sweeping Lainey out of his grip, and behind the shield of his own body, in a single motion, and the weapon was taken, and the cousin who had tried twice to destroy him was on the marble floor and pinned before he understood he had lost. Then Enzo's men were upon Marco, and this time there would be no exile and no second chance, only the long, cold reckoning of the law and the family both, and he was taken from the hall for the last time, and the doors closed on him forever. Luca did not watch him go. He had already turned to Lainey, gathering her against his chest as she shook, murmuring her name over and over, as though he could not quite believe he held her, and she clung to him and wept the tears she had held back, through every loss of her life. It was Don Aldo who broke the silence, the old man rising from his chair, and looking for a long moment at the girl in his grandson's arms, the baker's daughter he had scorned, the nobody who had been kidnapped and threatened, and had signed away her own happiness to save her dying mother, and had once asked the family for anything. He crossed the hall slowly, and he took Lainey's hand in his ancient trembling one, and he said, loud enough for every soul present to hear, that he had been a foolish old man who had mistaken pedigree for worth, and that any woman who could be broken so many times and still choose love over bitterness had more of the true blood of a family in her than all his pedigrees combined, and that from this day she was a Ferraro, and that he would strike down anyone who said otherwise. The surgery that Lainey had sat outside of with a breaking heart did not take her mother from her after all, for while she had waited alone in that corridor, believing the world was about to claim its last debt, Luca had already moved in the quiet way that had become the truest expression of his love. Arranging without a word to anyone that the finest surgeon in the region be brought to Colleen's bedside, and that no cost be spared, and no corner cut, so that when the long hours ended, it was to the news that the operation had succeeded, and that the stubborn woman who had carried sacks of flour up 18 stairs would carry them again. Colleen recovered slowly and loudly, complaining about the hospital food and terrorizing the nurses, and refusing to stay in bed a single day longer than she was forced to. And when at last she was well enough to come home, it was to a bakery that had risen from its own ashes, as surely as the man they had once named for them. Luca had seen to that too. The debts cleared, the ovens rebuilt, the little shop on the working side of the city restored and thriving, and word had spread of the place until the line down the block was no longer for photographs, but for the bread itself. And there was already quiet talk of a second location across town, and perhaps a third after that. On the morning the shop reopened its doors, Lainey stood behind the counter in the warm sugared air that had been the backdrop of her whole hard life, and Luca came to her and took her hand and pressed into it the one thing she had never expected to see again, the heavy dark wristwatch that Ash had once traded away to save her mother. Recovered quietly from Dumont, along with the debt it had settled, and he closed her fingers around it and told her softly that this was the thing that had first led his enemies to him, and might have been his ruin, but that it had only ever truly been a way home, and that it belonged now to the woman who had given him a home when he had nothing, that it should return to its rightful owner. Colleen, watching from her chair by the window with a blanket over her knees and color back in her cheeks, wiped her eyes and announced to the whole shop that she had known from the very first that she had chosen well. That other mothers married their daughters off to accountants and salesmen, while her son-in-law had turned out to be not merely her gentle Ash, but the dawn of the most powerful family in Chicago, and she declared with enormous satisfaction that no other mother in the city had ever made a finer match from a man she quite literally picked up off the road. They laughed, all of them, in the warmth of the little shop, and Lainey leaned into the man beside her, the baker and the boss, the stranger and the husband, the two halves of him that had always been one, and understood at last the thing that all her losses had never managed to teach her, that the worth of a person had never lain in what they owned or in what the world could take away, but in the simple and unbreakable fact that when everything was gone, there was still someone who chose to stay, and that she had found, after a lifetime of being left, the one man who never would. If this story touched something in your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to like and share this video so that you never miss the new stories we bring you every single day. And we would love to hear how this one made you feel. So please leave a comment and share the emotions it stirred in you, because your words mean the world to us, and we read every one of them from the bottom of our hearts. We wish every one of you watching good health, a joyful life, and peace in all your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.